Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you here. You know, you throw a party and you don't know if anyone's going to show up, and we were hoping, okay, maybe we'll have 200 folks, because that's been about the usual number that we've received at our last couple of events. And to hit this mark of 320 is quite an honor. So we really want to have a rich dialogue. We want to learn from you, hear from you, and without kind of an event like this, we don't get that opportunity for reflection on who we are as an industry, as a community, as a group of people that have the opportunity to steward, much of the Coast Range of California. So I'm thrilled to have you all be here and help us in that process, and I look forward to learning from all of you. I was hired in 2000 into the extension position, and so I was not fortunate to be here at the 1996 symposium, but I found myself opening up the symposium proceedings and realizing what an important booklet it was, because it gave me a sense of who we were as a society, as a group in 1996. And so I thought to kind of kick off our morning and kick off our next 3 days together, I would do a little reflection. The notion of change is something that's always constant, but it's important to be able to look back and think about who we were 20 years ago and how we have changed. And that, I think, gives us an opportunity to think about where we want to go as a society, as an organization, as communities. So I have just a few slides that I'm going to step through, thinking about ownership, infrastructure, markets, and some of the challenges and issues. I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of logistics about the morning and the time together, and then I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So that's kind of the format for the next few minutes. These are in no way a complete set of thoughts. They're really reflection on kind of the working forest land of the Coast Range, of which the redwood component is a big part of that. So to kick us off, I thought I'd just kind of aggregate out to the California landscape, and we know that California is 100 million acres, of which about a third of that is forested, and of the forested portion, it's about equally divided between public and private ownership, just at the gross scale. When you look at the Coast Range, that division is much different. It is primarily privately owned, and it's primarily equally divided between large ownership and small ownership, lots of families in the mix. So we work here in the Coast Range in really a privately owned landscape, which means that how you inform policy, how families make decisions is a very personal process, and it involves a lot of complex discussions over time and generations working things out. When you look at the Coast Range within that, the Redwood Belt shown in red, the Douglas Fir Belt shown in green, occupy some of the same niches, but they face different pressures and different challenges. I want to acknowledge FRAP, the CAL FIRE program, for giving us a few graphics to help us out this morning. What I'd like to suggest is that the redwood forest element of this is really still largely in a working forest condition, but the Douglas Fir Range is in a much more vulnerable position right now for conversion to other land uses and other challenges. And in many respects, I think we may see that Douglas Fir Belt transition into other land uses in the near future if we're not thoughtful and careful about how we help think about the stewardship and the policies and the markets and the infrastructures that support that working landscape. I'll get at that notion in a bit more. In thinking about who owns this landscape and who we work with, one of the things that I was struck by is how much change in ownership we've had over the last 20 years. And so I'm going to put together a fairly confusing graph, but I want to give you a sense of some of the name changes that have happened over the last 20 years within that industrial forest land of the Coast Range. So what the image on the right shows is kind of the footprint of the industrial landscape throughout California. What I've done is organized kind of some of the major land transactions that have happened over the last 20 years, just as a moment of reflection. I mean, I think we all know that the Palcos and Louisiana Pacifics and Georgia Pacifics are names of the past. But when you aggregate out and you look at the significance in ownership changes, it's I think it's rather remarkable. I'm not going to go through this in detail. It doesn't reflect every transaction out here. But when you look at who owns our landscape, you see that there are several new public owners. The Headwaters Reserve is, I think, probably the best known of those. There's also the Simpson tract in Del Norte County, also known as Millerellum, that's now in state parks. There's a new community forest in Eureka that we're going to tour and see some talks on throughout this week. We've got some new tribal ownership. We have a new international ownership. But I think the more significant element within this change is that we've gone from publicly traded companies largely to privately held companies, and with a much more long-term family investment format for the Coast Range, and I think that's a good thing. There are a lot of new nonprofit ownerships, and we're going to talk probably some about that in our next set of talks. And Mendocino County has gone through quite a lot of transition, and you can see some of the names that you may recognize down there in the list. But this new form of ownership in kind of a conservation format with a nonprofit at its leadership is new. We have seen also during this time period the introduction of timber investment management organizations, or TIMOs, and we've seen them exit, and then we've seen a new sort of TIMO come into our landscape with Lime Redwood Company, and I call them sort of a TIMO with a conservation heart, and I'll let others describe that maybe better, but it's a new set of owners, and I think it's important to take a moment and think about what that means for outputs, means for management, means for conservation of species, and also to remember that the private family ranch landowners have largely not traded over and changed over during this time period, but they face enormous pressures and enormous challenges. So I don't know what we're going to look like in 20 years, and if 20 years is the right time frame for reflection, but this to me provides an interesting opportunity to remember how much transition we've had. During the last 20 years, we've also seen a large number of sawmills close throughout California. We're not immune to that here in the North Coast, and in fact, I think that famous image of the last log in Corbel is fairly reflective of that change in infrastructure, change in capacity for processing. And the limited availability of mills reduces opportunities for many landowners, and I think we should be aware of how that interplays together. When you look at our existing infrastructure of mills, you can see that we look very different than we did 20 years ago, and yet we do have a new mill coming back on, which is the Corbel mill, has been purchased by the Schmidt-Bauer family, and so that does provide a little bit more opportunity here in the North Coast. I'd like to underscore a little bit about biomass and the bioenergy market and the ability to process residuals that come out of sawmills, and the ability to also manage fuels, do forest health projects and other forms of activity where you have low economic value of the product that's being harvested, or the product that is coming out of the end of the sawmill processing. We're seeing tremendous transition in California. This map will look very different probably at the end of this year, and that creates a great vulnerability to a lot of our sawmill processing capacity and our ability to do restoration activities. These changes are, bigger than any one region. They're really, stuck at a policy level in the state of California, and how we decide we're going to invest in renewable energy is really at play. But being in the forest sector, we suffer kind of the downhill side of that. So in terms of infrastructure, there's many elements to be thinking about. A little look at markets and how markets have changed through time. This graph represents 1945 to 2015, and illustrates the counties of the North Coast and the North Coast in total. Humboldt is shown in black, Mendocino in green, and the blues are both Del Norte and Sonoma. So a couple things to point out. In 2000 was essentially the end of the old growth harvesting, and so now we are all young growth or second growth and third growth harvesting. We went through a national recession, which you can see in 2009, quite that spike to the bottom, and there is some evidence of recovery. It's been slow. And I think what you can really see is that the change in harvest, the change in values has really been expressed through the output of timber products being harvested in the North Coast. When you compare the North Coast to the state trends, you can see that the North Coast is in blue, the state is in red, that the proportion, the North Coast is making up a larger proportion of the total harvest in the state now than ever before. And that's in part a reflection on the reduced amount of harvest that's coming off the public land base, and that there's less public land in the North Coast. So as I kind of wrap up this little look at some of the changes that have affected the working forest land, I want to just kind of summarize that through a couple of thoughts here. And that is that there's a landscape of new larger sized landowners, and these are largely family-owned companies and conservation groups, and they present different choices and different options than we were looking at 20 years ago. We have seen a significant loss in infrastructure, and that infrastructure is not only limited to mills and energy facilities, but it's also related to the skilled workforce that we use for trucking, processing, harvesting, and that skilled workforce can work in a whole variety of contexts, including restoration, so that means that we have less availability for resources to be able to do some of the activities that we'd like to do. I think one of the other interesting elements is that the mills are generally now tied to the production from the industrial land base, and so the non-industrial wood is a bit less competitive than it was 20 years ago because of the reduced amount of sawmill production capacity within the North Coast and within the Coast Range in general. We're also seeing conversion to other land uses, both fragmentation, especially on the lower value forest lands, and there's there's been a 20-year process of trying to evolve and think about how we address the incompatibility, the compatibility, the ever-going pressure from the marijuana economy. And what we're seeing, at least in Humboldt, I will say, is that marijuana has become a really big competitor. And if you're in the Douglas Fir belt, there is there are some interesting choices that are happening right now, and people are, especially families, are having to make decisions about, there's good money to be able to sell your land right now. And so I think we have to think about that from a political perspective, I think families are going to have to make some difficult choices because the money's good right now. And so that means that erodes in some way the working land base, and that also changes kind of how we steward resources at a state level. So the regulatory environment has substantially changed over the last 20 years. I found it fun to reflect on the 1996 proceedings because there were a couple of talks in there that foreshadowed some of the issues. There was, I believe, one owl talk, there was one Pacific fisher talk, and there were 2 or 3 watershed talks. When you look at where the bulk of our program was in 2003, 2011, and really today, I mean, that is our dominant conversation, is around how do we manage these sensitive species, how do we manage watersheds, how do we manage ecosystem services, and the change in influence from science is significant. And the policy arena has significantly pushed that conversation and that management style. Management has changed substantially over the last 20 years as well, and we should recognize that we largely plan at a landscape level now and based really on kind of watershed level thinking, and that is a really significant change. We should also note that clear cutting is relatively rare over the last 20 years, and it's almost now always includes structural retention. So it's in high contrast to our neighboring state of Oregon, and I think we should look back and think about that level of change. I'd also like to acknowledge the large investments that have been made in transportation networks. If you think about this over the last 20 years, it's been roads, and it's been about realigning those roads to meet a different harvesting system. It's about making sure those roads are disconnected from the water courses, making sure that we realign everything so that we're causing minimal damage or impact to the watersheds. And so when you think about the infrastructure of the working forest land, it looks very different now than it did 20 years ago. And harvesting approaches have changed commensurately with that, and we've moved to a lot of different systems now, less ground-based, more skyline, more shovel logging, more of other strategies. So how we harvest timber looks very different. The markets are always an interesting discussion. We certainly are a young growth economy now, so we are second and third growth predominantly. It's fairly evident, but redwood is certainly much more valuable than Douglas fir, and Douglas fir its markets tend to be tied to the housing market overall. We've seen over the last 20 years some spot markets, export spot markets into the Pacific Rim, and those will probably continue in a sort of episodic way, and have been a bright spot, especially following the 2009 recession, which really made it hard to think about investing in forest land. We've had some new kinds of markets. Carbon was something we didn't talk about 20 years ago. There was a little bit of hint towards certification 20 years ago. The Coast Range and the industrial ownership base and many of the family ownership bases are all pretty much certified now through one system or another. That is a really big change. And just looking forward a little bit, and Rick mentioned a bit about this morning, we do see more and more investment in redwood planting and potential future output from international sources. So I wonder what we'll be doing in 20 years in terms of our conversation about redwood and whether we'll be having an international symposium more so than we are today, though we do have some folks from New Zealand here this week, so that's great. And as I wrap up, I want to think a little bit about the social dynamics and how those have changed over the last 20 years. I see a bunch of people standing back there. There's certainly a lot more seats up here, open tables over there, so come on in, you guys. So socially, think about this. Families are in transition. We have, when you look at some baby boomers are finally beginning to be in a position of leadership in their family ownerships. There is just a lot of change happening within the ranchland families in particular, and all of our families. And I think families are going to have to make some difficult choices about whether they stick in the family business or whether they move into other opportunities. I'd like to acknowledge that a good third to half of this room are filled with women, and the amount of women in the profession is a significant change and a very positive one. We see huge numbers both in college but also in the profession now as scientists, foresters, and managers, and I want to thank you, gentlemen, for accepting us and working with us. I know it's not always easy, but it's, I think, a point of note. And I don't think the trend's going away when you look at our college graduating classes. So we're here to say. Also, the influence of science and the influence of science within the agencies, within the companies, within the consulting firms is a significant change over the last 20 years. And we now have many companies that have science teams that are bigger than their forestry staff, and I think that's worth noting. it's a rather significant shift. And I think what's really lovely about that is that people know so much more about their own land now, and they have real evidence-based information to be able to have good discussions about how we manage these public trust resources, and we're learning great things about that, and this conference is a wonderful reflection of that great change in knowledge. And last but not least, I want to call out to the Environmental Protection Information Center, because they sent out a piece of information last week which was a reflection on 30 years of struggle around the Headwaters forest deal. And it was filled with some pretty pivotal photos and some images from Greg King. And I found myself thinking back, and I see Tracy Cattleman in the room, I see Kim Rodriguez in the room, and I just want to say that the 1996 conference planners were nervous about bringing together a mixed audience of interests and values, and we've moved past that. We're a place and a time where we're good at communicating with each other, and we're good at listening to each other. There's always room for improvement, but there is much better communication now between communities and forest management, and I think I appreciate those who have nudged us on the way. I'm challenged by those conversations on a daily basis, but I also feel like we're in a place where we can have more informed dialogue and get to better decisions and perhaps a little less conflict, because we know that if we can listen to each other, we can probably find some common ground instead of just yelling at each other. So there's a lot that's happened over the last 20 years. I don't know what we're going to look like in the next decade, but I thought by weaving together a few of these ideas, it might help set the stage for our series of plenary speakers and for the next 3 days of dialogue and conversation. So these are just some thoughts, some notions, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with each of you and having you challenge me on some of my thinkings here and set me straight, I'm sure. But I hope that over the next 3 days we can kind of continue this point of reflection and think about who we want to be and where we want to go. I have just a couple kind of housekeeping and logistics things to go through, and then I'll introduce our next speaker. So I know you've got a thick packet. I just want to express that there are 7 plenary talks. They reflect science, ecology, policy, economics, conservation, history, kind of as major themes. They're structured so that there's 4 of them this morning and then 3 of them on Thursday afternoon. In between, we're going to see 69 concurrent talks. There's going to be 3 different rooms. This room will divide into B and A. B for big, A for the smaller room. You can see where it divides across. There's a third building, or another building with the third room. It's called Annex, which is just right across the parking lot. So we'll have an hour and a half break at lunch. We'll see a little transition, and then this will be B, A, and Annex. And that represents about 8 general theme talks. There are abstracts where you can look at those talks in your packets, and I know that folks will want to kind of pick and choose between those different themes. We partially chose this building because it allows us to kind of move rapidly between those different locations and hopefully quietly so that we can make sure everybody stays on track. We know the importance of recording proceedings for this, and we've typically done a general technical report. We work with the Forest Service to produce a written proceedings, and most everyone has been submitting their talks into papers, and so we're committed to working through that. We're trying something a little new this year. We're in the Sequoia Conference Center, which is part of the Humboldt County Office of Education. This is a new facility, and they have the ability for us to do some audio recording, and so we're going to try and create an audio recording and an audio proceedings, basically, of all the talks. So it'll take us a little bit of time to make that, but in the near future you'll get information about the links to those, so you should be able to see some of the talks that you have to choose between. So I want to thank everyone for being willing to work with us through that. That means that we'd very much like to use the microphones for questions so that we can record that properly and make sure that it all makes sense. So I want to thank all the session chairs for keeping everybody on track and making all those pieces work. Let's see, so I talked about logistics in terms of the breakout room arrangement. just to headline this, that the poster session and reception, we're going to have a fabulous dinner and drinks available, is not here. It's at the Adorney Center, which is down on the waterfront, and I'll show you in a map in a minute as to where that is. If you're staying at the Red Line, it's both walkable and drivable from there, and there's plenty of parking at that location. And for those of you who've signed up for the fabulous field trips, they are departing from Redwood Acres. We are going to leave at 8 o'clock promptly, so we want everyone to be there by 7:30 to make sure you get into the right bus and the right location. There are some parking logistics there. There's some places where we can park and places where we can't park, so look for people to direct you into those locations. We're going to be in the big parking lot across the street to the north of Redwood Acres. And then I also want to acknowledge that there's several groups that have decided to meet while they're here, including the Sonoma Forest Conference Planning Team for the 2017 event. They've been putting on a regular conference over the last couple of years, and they're planning one for 2017, and they love your ideas. And so they've reserved a room Wednesday from 6 to 7:30 at the Red Lion, and if you'd like to help them think about their conference, which I think will touch similar themes and has that goal of integration and has that goal of bringing a wide audience together, they'd love your help there. And there's a bunch of folks from the Sonoma group here, so thanks for doing that. Also, thanks for sponsoring our conference here. The Forest Guild is going to meet Wednesday at 6:30 at Plaza Grill, and Guild members are invited, and you'll probably hear a little bit more about that at the poster session tonight. And then a number of the agencies would like to meet, and so they're meeting Thursday at 3 o'clock, and I believe any are welcome to that session. So just as my last close, here is the map. It's in your packet just to help outline where these different events are. And if any of you are from out of town and are struggling with trying to understand this map, find one of us and we'll help you figure it out. The Adorney Center is... I can't find... So here's the funny thing. For all you speakers here, there's no pointer. The pointer is the mouse. Of course, I can't make it move. So we're a little bit limited that way, but so the Adorney Center is down there on the waterfront, and we are at Sequoia here. That's the Red Lion Hotel, and the inset represents how you get to Redwood Acres, which is off Myrtle, which is the same street that the conference center is on. So with that, that hits most of our logistics. If you've got questions, come find one of us as a conference planner team. Our folks at the front desk can help you. So that's that. Thank you for the time. I'm going to transition to our next speaker, which is Tom Tuchman. And are you going to load up his talk? Okay, that'd be great. So Tom is with U.S. Forest Capital, which is a private consultancy for what I'm going to call conservation land deals. And Tom's going to fill our kind of our conservation theme, and his talk is called Conservation Strategies: Where Are We and Where Are We Going? And part of the reason we thought we'd bring Tom here is he has some great historical perspective on a number of issues, and I'd like to just identify that he was a special assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, and during his time he was involved in the direct negotiations for the Headwaters Forest Agreement. Hey, that has significant bearing to us, doesn't it? He was also in charge of a number of different things that include being director of the U.S. Office of Forest and Economic Development, where he was developing and implementing President Clinton's Northwest Forest Plan. That has had some significant bearing for us here. And he's been involved in a number of other public-related activities. He was the lead staff for the U.S. Senate Agriculture Committee, where he developed a number of programs, some of which we may know as Forest Legacy, Forest Stewardship, and others. And he was also the director of the Resource Policy for the Society of American Foresters. So Tom comes with a variety of experiences, and I think will give us a good sense of some of these changes in conservation strategies and changes in policy that help shape us today. So thank you very much for being here, Tom.